Hey everyone, welcome back to the NPTE podcast. This is Will Crane, your host. Thank you so much for joining me as we go through the content you need in order to dominate on test day. So today I've got a special episode for you. Today is dedicated to how to deal with the blow of failing the NPTE, how to avoid failing the NPTE. And this episode really is especially for those of you who have had a failed attempt and those of you who are worried about a failed attempt. I want to talk about that. But before we get to that, just a quick thank you. Thank you for what you do. I know that as you go through this process, it's quite difficult, can be quite vexing at times. Let me tell you, big thank you for what you do. I know that as you are going through your study process, that there's a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears that goes into this. And I just want to let you know that I appreciate it. And I appreciate you spending time with me, your precious study time, spending that time with me. And so I want to make this as useful and helpful as possible as we go through this content. So this episode dedicated entirely to what to do if you fail the NPTE. Now, maybe the biggest thing to remember if you have had a failed attempt on the NPTE is that failing an exam attempt does not make you a failure. And I need to make sure I say that multiple times, that failing an exam attempt does not make you a failure. Really, the only failure that exists is the failure to try, or the failure to do your very best. And so therefore, the biggest thing to remember here is that although you have had a failed attempt, the biggest thing to remember is that this is your passion. This is what you love doing. And although it is a blow, there's a lot that goes into this. We'll talk about the stages of grief here in a minute, but there's a lot to this. Just remember that it's worth it. It's something you've studied. It really coincides with your skills and your interest, your passion. And so maybe the biggest thing to remember is that you are good at this. Now, an exam attempt where you have a failed attempt, this is something that's extremely frustrating. Again, we'll talk about all the feels here in a moment. But the point is, just remember that this is a worthwhile and good endeavor that the path that you are on right now, absolutely worthwhile, certainly something that you want to do. And so again, there's a big difference between failing an exam and becoming a failure. And again, you should never equate the two. Sometimes it just takes a couple of attempts to get through the exam. Now, granted, it's not the way you drew it up. It's not what you'd like to do. Chances are, if you're like everybody, you want to pass on the first time. You don't want to have to do it again. It gets quite expensive doing it again and again. But the point is that just remember, as you start with heart, that means that you start with the intent that you are going to do your very, very best. You understand the implications of this test, but also why it is that you chose this path in the beginning. So first things first is to just recognize that a failed attempt is quite frustrating. There's a lot of emotion that goes into it, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment, all of the stages of grieving. But if you have had a failed attempt, the very first thing to do after you've had that initial blow, you see the score, what do you do after that? Well, the first step, as best you can, you try to analyze your game day performance. Well, what does that mean? So analyzing game day performance looks something like this. You try to determine precisely what could have gone wrong. And sometimes it's a multifactorial. So don't get me wrong. It's not like there's usually just one thing that went bad. But let's say that you ran out of time. So that would be an example of analyzing your performance and saying, I didn't use my time wisely. I ran out of time. Whatever it is, that could be a game changer for the next time you test. Other things would be to analyze your content skills. So what does that mean? That means, all right, there were a lot of questions that asked me about XYZ. How can I improve my performance in that content category so that when I see questions like that again, I'm not stumped. I know precisely what it is they're going for. So whenever it comes to a test-taking performance, there's always two characteristics. One is the mechanics, basically how well you navigated the test day experience. And the other one is the content. So we've got the mechanics and the content of the exam. Content obviously being, do you know your dermatomes and myotomes? Do you know about differential diagnosis between X, Y, and Z conditions? The point is you have to hone both of those skills in order to improve your performance. One is the test-taking skills, so navigating test day, having adequate time, making sure that you keep your mind focused and sharp the entire time. And the second one is content skills, making sure that you have a clear understanding of content. And this is something that, again, speaking very frankly here, so this is where Will is sitting across from you, knee to knee, telling you that there's always more to learn. I mean, the number of times I've had people who I've talked to, they tell me how skilled they are at the content, and it is true. And I've said it before that this is stuff that you're good at. I suppose it's a little bit of taking a step back and saying to yourself, all right, although I do know so much, there is more that I can learn. And so, speaking clearly from experience, I've been doing this for 12 years now. I've been helping students for over a decade pass their exams. And I still occasionally run into questions that I've never heard of before, content or material that if I did learn it, it was a very long time ago and I don't remember it very well. Even with me in the game, essentially studying year round for this test, I find that the content, there's just a vast quantity of content, absolutely huge. So having that understanding that you can absolutely improve your content skill, and a lot of times we can self-identify, and that's onto the next point here, is identify areas that need a little bit of improvement. Now, most of the time, there's two ways to get to this. Number one is self-identification. This is where you just sit down and you kind of have a heart-to-heart with yourself saying, I've always struggled with this particular topic or this particular body system. I know that I need to improve. That should be one of my key areas that I build up. So number one, identifying weak areas. You can do that with just self-identification. The other way to do that, to identify weak areas, is through practice questions. So either on the test or off the test, on practice tests, you can identify areas that you may be able to recognize, but you may not be able to answer questions about. So a classic example of this would be, let's say you've always memorized that Froment sign is testing the ulnar nerve. Well, so if you always have on your flashcard Froment sign, ulnar nerve, Froment sign, ulnar nerve, if they ask you a question about a patient is performing the Froment sign and they have a hyperflexed, or performing the Froment's test, and they have a hyperflexed or flexed interphalangeal joint of their thumb, you have to then make an interpretation. Okay, what in the world does that mean? Well, a positive Froment sign, where you're trying to grip the paper in the key pinch grip, if you flex the IP joint of the thumb, that is a positive. If you keep the IP joint of the thumb extended, so keeping the thumb flat, that tells you it's a negative Froment sign. So again, I guess my point here is that so often we memorize the 10,000 foot view of the content when really we have to have a deeper understanding of what precisely is going on. And if you can do that, you'll find that you'll answer questions better on test day because you understand them more clearly. All right, so you've analyzed your performance, you've identified weak areas that need improvement. So now it's we have to have the rubber meet the road. How are we going to create a game plan that can actually lead to results on test day? So what does this look like? Well, number one, it requires adequate study time. Now, adequate study time comes in a lot of different flavors for a lot of different people. My very general recommendation is that it takes about 2 to 4 hours most days for about 10 to 12 weeks in order to pass the exam. And again, extremely general, with the idea that if you are distant or far removed from PT school, it may take you double that amount of time. Or maybe you're very fresh out of PT school and you recall everything that you learned during PT school, then chances are you might need about half of that. So 2 to 4 hours most days is an excellent target for creating your game plan or your actual study plan. The other thing is mapping out your days of the week. Now, again, speaking very frankly, most of you have some very significant responsibilities in your life, whether that's, like I just talked to a few students this week, they've got full-time work at a PT clinic, they've got full-time work, or they have an evening job, or they have very significant family responsibilities, whether that's with an aging parent, with their own children, whatever it is, chances are you've got something quite serious that you are taking care of besides studying for this very important exam. Like I just talked to a student the other day, planning for a wedding, a honeymoon, like the whole 9 yards around a huge or major life event. And the point is that you have to be quite reasonable with yourself. Number one, you have to recognize that you need to spend time studying. But number two, you need to really create boundaries around your study time so that, in a sense, when you sit down to study, that is your absolute sacred time for studying, not to be distracted by any other extracurricular activity. So creating that game plan involves, number one, so I keep saying number one and number two, but creating a good game plan, you've got to absolutely have the available time And then you've got to plug into that time content, the weak areas that you need to improve on. So now, obviously, this involves lots and lots and lots of content. I'm a huge proponent of practice question review. In fact, evidence-based strategies for PTs carries over nicely into study strategies. Evidence-based study strategies indicate that practice questions are the number one way to study because it presents it to you in a way that's very test-like, but it also forces you to commit to an answer. And then once you commit to that answer, you can then, usually there's an emotional response of either, yes, I got it, or, oh, I can't believe I didn't get it. And that emotional response does lead to better long-term memory retention. And then, so once you've identified weak areas, you've created a game plan, you're working on it, then you need to plan when you'll take the next exam. Now, again, this is very much a willism here, but I would suggest, this is, again, quite a general suggestion, is that you take it sooner rather than later. Now, I get this question all the time. If I've had a failed attempt, should I take it the next administration or should I wait until the following one? So should I wait 3 months or 6 months? And there are cases when you absolutely have to wait 6 months. That would be in the case that you had the 3 in a row rule kick in. So the 3 in a row rule is simply that you can only take 3 exam administrations in a row before you are forced by the system to sit out for an exam administration. So that means if you've taken it January, April, and July, you'd not be permitted to take it in October. You'd have to wait until the following January administration. So essentially you can only take it 3 in a row before you have to take a break. So in those cases, you are forced to wait the 6 months. But the only other time I tell people to wait the 6 months is if there's some significant life happening or that they have a very or severely low score. So let's say you had an absolutely terrible performance on exam day. It may take some more time to remediate that. Or another example, let's say you've got I don't know, any number. I've heard so many different stories from different students. So family illnesses, international travel. I mean, there's any number of reasons why you might need to postpone your exam date. But generally speaking, I tell people to take it sooner rather than later. And then finally, we get into, okay, now we've made a plan, we've got the available time, we've targeted an exam date. So then we get into, okay, what does the day-to-day grind look like? And this is where being a part of a study group can be extremely helpful. This is where, like the VIP course that I run every quarter, this is where we spend a ton of time just going through content, and it's an extremely uplifting and small group style setting where you can be with people who are in similar situations. You can be in a very compassionate environment to work towards a common goal. Now, it is certainly a lot of work, so don't get me wrong. But the point is that you want to stay on track. It requires accountability. And a lot of times being a part of a course is extremely helpful for that accountability. And then throughout the entirety of this process, you need to remember why you're doing this. Why is it that you're going through all this pain and effort, if not to progress to and become an awesome PT? You want to become and enter the field of PT, not only for the financial benefit. So clearly it's better to be working and getting a positive paycheck rather than a negative, or paying out to be a part of, to have the PT experience. But the point is that you like this. You actually like this material. You like the content. You like the patients. Chances are the patients really like you. So it's a really good motivator to consider why it is that you're going through all this pain and agony in order to prepare for the exam. So keeping that all in mind is extremely important, just because, again, it is a good and noble thing that you're doing. So as I mentioned earlier, when you do have a failed NPTE attempt, this is a lot what you'll experience afterwards. You get what they quite literally, the stages of grief happen. So the first stage of grief is the denial or isolation stage. So what does this mean? This means that you simply can't believe it. There's absolute disbelief. You are in denial that it occurred. Now, the key thing as I go through all these stages of grief is that it is not a linear progression. Rather, it ends up being more like a squiggly line. It jumps between from one stage to another stage. You could feel all 5 stages in one day. You could feel only 2 of the stages. Whatever it is, your experience, you'll find that you will feel all the feels as you go through this. So denial, isolation. You move on to anger, blaming external factors, trying to blaming the exam, lashing out to exam administrators, to even to supportive loved ones, the anger can really kick in at that point. Afterwards, then you get into the bargaining phases where if only I'd studied more, I would have passed. If only I'd tried a little harder, if only I'd paid a little more attention. These types of things where you are bargaining with the powers that be. And then we get into the part, so the kind of the last negative stage of grief is the depression or sadness or regret. This is where you just feel down about the entire experience. But hopefully you can move into the final stage of grief, which is acceptance. Acceptance is where you make peace with the event, you take it for what it is, and you move on with the new plan. And this is something that I've heard mentioned before. Like, I think John Deloney talks about this a lot, that whenever there is a major life change that was not expected, you have a picture in your mind of what it should have looked like. But that is different than the reality at the moment. So that's why you have to grieve or mourn the loss of what you expected to now take what is unexpected, the thing that you would not have asked for or wished for, but actually it's in your lap right now. You need to make sure that you identify, okay, the new reality, I have to mourn the loss of the picture I had, but now I deal with the new reality. And then again, this is a big thing that I take from John Deloney, is that you do the next right step. So what is the next best or the next right step? And you'll find that usually leads to just taking a minute. It might take a minute to go through these stages of grief. It might take a couple of days, but the goal is to work through them. And again, understanding that in any given day, you could experience all of these. So I had I'll share a brief personal experience here. When I was in PT school, we had a student who was supposed to be the year ahead of me in PT school, but he showed up in our second or third semester of PT school. He had been held back a year and showed up in our tests and measures class. And very, very fine fellow. It turns out, found out his story, like, where'd you come from? Like, you weren't here the last couple of semesters. Where'd you come from? Turns out that he had failed out of that same class the year previous. And it really, a really frustrating situation where he had, admittedly, he'll tell you that he admittedly had not put in a 100% effort on his first time around through the class, kind of squeaked by all the way till the final. And the final was a free response test. It certainly wasn't multiple choice, free response test, paragraph style. And he takes this test, and it's right before Christmas break. So the holiday break comes, and then everyone's gone, campus is empty. And he gets an email notification saying that he failed and he would not be allowed to progress to the next semester. And so he's on break, but he's trying to figure out, get to the bottom of this. What happened? What precisely was the score? Well, it turns out he missed passing, again, on this free response essay style exam. He missed passing by 1 point out of like 200. So he missed it by 1 point out of 200. The professor would not budge. The dean of students stood by the professor and said, the professor says what they say. And so really he had no recourse other than to wait a year and retake the test or retake the class when it was offered the following year. So full 12 months goes by. I mean, this kid, he goes from, again, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, all of the feels, just absolutely seething in anger. But the part that I found so impressive was that he took that anger, took all that grief and built up emotion, and he was in my class now, taking the class again for the second time. And I'd overheard the professor tell someone, like, they didn't know that I'd heard them. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I just overheard them say to another professor, yeah, this student, they're just not cut out to be a PT. Well, so it comes through the second time around. He was one of my study partners. We worked through a lot of things together. And no joke, he absolutely aced the class. 100% on the final, 100% on every midterm, absolutely aced it. And he'd taken a negative situation and had turned it to his benefit to become an expert at the content. And so that should be a goal that we all have whenever we experience a setback, rather than languishing in the anger, the depression, the denial, the isolation, the bargaining. Rather than languishing there, actually move on to that acceptance where you recognize your own weaknesses and absolutely knock the socks off of the NPTE. And perhaps that's the biggest moral here, is that this is just an exam. You know this content. So now how can you absolutely dominate on test day? And so the only way to do that is you got to know the material. You got to perform well on test day. All of this back to making an adequate study plan and just locking in and making it happen. So there you go. Oh my goodness, I should probably do a full episode on the number of situations I've had with students who have had a failed attempt and then have come back for the win. If you go over to our reviews page, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reviews of students who have passed the exam, lots and lots of them after a failed attempt. And it is so inspiring. So if you need a little pick-me-up, just go over to ptfinalexam.com/reviews. Check out our reviews page, and it is just absolutely inspiring, the number of students who have made it through despite all of the odds being against them. All right, so with that, we'll bring today to a conclusion. Again, kind of a longer episode here, but I feel like it's so critical. If you have had a failed attempt on the NPTE, just remember, this is worthwhile. This is stuff that you love doing. You love PT. Absolutely worthwhile doing, and this test, you can absolutely dominate it. You can pass the NPTE. So with that, we'll bring it to a conclusion. I hope you'll check out ptfinalexam.com for all the great course offerings we have. I mentioned earlier about our VIP course. The VIP course is a great, compassionate way to go through the content in an extremely robust pattern. Tons and tons and tons of practice questions, lots of pre-recorded material on demand. There's just, again, I don't think you'll find a better resource out there to pass the NPTE. And then, as always, if you haven't, it only takes like 1 second. Go over to Google Play, Apple iTunes, or Spotify, wherever it is you're listening to this podcast. Give us a quick 5-star review. It helps so much as we're trying to pass the word along. Hell, it may even help a student who has failed the NPTE hear this message, and just by you taking that moment and leaving that review helps get it up in the algorithms so that they can find it and see some hope, some light at the end of the tunnel. And that's the goal here at PT Final Exam. So with that, we'll bring it to a conclusion. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for what you do. Keep a grin on your chin. Stay safe out there. Will Crane and fist pumps all around, and I'll catch you all in the next episode. Thanks.